Okay, so welcome everybody. I'm Claire. I work in the climate team at Queensland Conservation Council. I want to pay my respects firstly to the traditional owners of the land whose sovereignty was never ceded. I'm in Maganjan, Brisbane, and the land of the Yagara and Turrbal people, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and acknowledge the ongoing connection to country that all First Nations people have in this land and the importance and huge role that they play in protecting this beautiful country. So tonight we are going to be talking about the need for bioregional planning. It's going to be an important few months in terms of Queensland's nature laws and Australia's nature laws. So we are excited to welcome you here to give a bit of background on why the nature law reform is so important, and particularly the need for bioregional planning. We're excited to have Natalie Frost, QCC's nature campaigner, and Bora Asker, who's a PhD candidate at the University of Queensland, here with us to present to us. We're running this reasonably informally, but if you could stay on mute, that would be great, just in case there's any background noise. If you have, like Katie has suggested, if you can introduce yourself and the country you're calling in from in the chat, that would be great. Yeah, if you have questions that come up that come into your mind during the speakers, so we'll hear first from Natalie and then from Bora, then please put them in the chat, and so that we can remember to come back to you, and we'll get you to unmute to ask your questions at the end. If you want to, like Katie is demonstrating, preface your question with question and for either Natalie or Bora, then that will just help us make sure that we can direct the questions correctly. And Katie has just demonstrated this with a great question, and we will tell you all about the rally that we're having next week in Brisbane to call for stronger nature laws on the 30th of January in Waterfront Place in Brisbane. So stay tuned for that. But now let's get into it. I'm going to hand over to Natalie Frost to give us a bit of an overview of the federal nature laws and the EPBC reform process.
Thanks so much, Claire, and it's lovely to see you all tonight for the first webinar of the year. So I'm just going to talk quite briefly about a bit of an overview of the EPBC Act and obviously the Samuel Review, which many of you I'm sure are aware of, and then where the EPBC reform process is up to, and then how regional planning fits into that. I'm then going to hand over to Bora, who is going to talk specifically about an important piece of research that QCC commissioned last year, and it talks about essentially the best practice bioregional planning principles and zoning rules. And then we'll talk about the next steps that are needed, and we'll go into a bit of a question. So yeah, there's only a few people on the call tonight, so please feel free to load up the chat with questions so we can have a bit more of a discussion at the end. So as most of you know, Australia's federal nature law is the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act. It was enacted in 2000, so it's now, 25 years old. It's quite aging, and it has been central to some of the most important environmental battles over the past 25 years. There was a review. So this was the second independent review. It's a statutory requirement that the EPBC Act is reviewed every 10 years. So Professor Graham Samuel undertook that review and put forward his report to the minister. That was in October 2020, then went public in 2021. So already, we're 5 years out from that report being completed. And it essentially found that the EPBC Act was fundamentally flawed. It wasn't meeting any objects of the Act. It's essentially just residing over the gradual decline of species across Australia. There are now more than 2,000 species listed under the EPBC Act, which is a good thing that those species are being listed. However, we obviously don't want to see that amount, and there's not enough resources and funding being put into recovering those species because there's been a long time where the actual listing of the species was delayed, and therefore any action to recover those species was delayed as well. So Professor Graham Semmel put forward a number of recommendations that showed essentially the entire Act need to be overhauled. There's major issues and just wasn't working essentially. And one of the big issues is the Act wasn't adequately addressing cumulative impacts. And so when a project was referred, so a proponent would need to refer their project under the EPBC Act, and then that project was looked at individually rather than looking at actually what's going on in the rest of this region, what's going on in the rest of the state or Australia in terms of, impacts to those specific species or other matters of national environmental significance. And so that's where tonight we're really talking about the role of bioregional planning and how that can help address cumulative impacts. But yeah, I just wanted to go over a little bit of the data of what has happened since the Act has come into effect. So there's been 7.7 million hectares of threatened species habitat that has been bulldozed. So rather than the Act actually stopping threatened species habitat being impacted, it's just, it's allowing it to happen with certain conditions. And those conditions obviously aren't working enough to recover those species. So that's one issue. The other issue is that actually the majority of bulldozing of threatened species habitat isn't actually referred for assessment under the EPBC Act. So there are a number of essential loopholes, exemptions, or just non-compliance measures that are happening. So more than 90% of land that has been cleared actually hasn't been referred for assessment. And here in Queensland, the major driver of land clearing and deforestation is for pasture and predominantly for beef. And so the majority of that you can see there in that beautiful, colourful pie chart I put in there is that industry, they're not actually referring any of that clearing for assessment. So the ag and forestry industry only makes up about 1.5% of referrals. The majority is actually for residential development and mining. So those obviously have big impacts, mining and residential development, but they are being referred and they've got conditions and management plans and things in place. However, the clearing, the broad scale clearing that is happening for beef, there's no management plans, there's no spotter catchers on hand, there's no actual thinking about, those species that are being lost while that bulldozing is taking place. My normal day job is deforestation campaigner. That's why I like to highlight those figures specifically. But yeah, it's really important to kind of just understand the fundamental failings of the EPBC Act. And you may have seen today, just wanted to do a little plug for our friends at ACF. They've put out new research today that showed under the Labor government in the last year, threatened species habitat approval through the EPBC Act has actually doubled. So 26,000 hectares was approved. The prior year was sitting just over 10,000 hectares. So the Act isn't working, and that's why we're here today to discuss, the real opportunities. And I guess I just want to highlight as well, just the timing. It's been 5 years since the review. Like everybody knows that it is failing and not enough is being done. And then right now as well, Australia's, signed the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. There are a number of international goals and commitments that Australia needs to meet by 2030, and that's not going to happen if we just keep waiting around. So I'm getting to full campaigner mode. I'll move on. But there was some good news, so in 2022, finally, the Labor government did respond after the coalition kind of sat on the Samuel review, and they acknowledged that, yes, we need a fundamental reform of the EPBC Act. They released the Nature Positive Plan. I think some of you may have been there at the QCC event where the minister did speak to that. So there was acknowledgement that things did need to change, and they put forward a plan to do so. One of the elements of the plan was using Queensland as a pilot for regional planning, and so it was really great to see on that day the State Environment Minister at the time, Megan Scanlon, signed an MOU with the federal government to develop 3 bioregional plans for Queensland. And at the time, the minister did say, I want to be making decisions based off those bioregional plans by the end of 2023. It's 2025. We're still here. So we don't have those bioregional plans in place. They are still being worked on. And what was, slightly encouraging to see is the last 2 Queensland state budgets did put forward funding to boost the team within the state that are working on those bioregional plans. They're actively working with their colleagues at DECU on a daily basis, and we regularly catch up with them to see the progress of that as well. They have developed a draft methodology for mapping and modelling the environmental values in certain areas. They've then undertaken 2 expert reviews of that. And my understanding is they'll be putting out some kind of public communication around that process at some point. But and moving forward with it, basically these bioregional plans, they will need to meet the National Environmental Standard on Regional Planning. And because that hasn't been legislated yet, that's still very much in draft mode. Both the state and feds are just kind of playing cat and mouse almost about ensuring that they're doing the work, but that it's going to meet these new standards that aren't legislated yet. So it's all kind of slowly ticking along. And we're obviously wanting to see that move a lot faster. And the work that Bora will talk to really outlines how that can be achieved. And that's why we commissioned that research, because it's like this is such an important piece of the puzzle for the EPBC Act reform, and Queensland's playing a leading role. So we wanted to go in there with that strong evidence base to show that this is how it can be done. And we commissioned that research, and we've got it ready to give to the Queensland Government last year. And they're still sitting on this in terms of any legislative reform, which is frustrating. But essentially what it means is there'll be like go zones and no-go zones of where development can and cannot occur. And I'll let Bora talk to that soon. But in terms of the broader EPBC Act reform, so they had the announcement in 2022, here's the nature positive plan. They then legislated the nature repair market, which essentially sets up a framework for legislated the voluntary biodiversity market. And that again is still in development at the moment. There are a number of methods and things that are being developed for that. And then all of a sudden they called the federal government, said, oh, we're doing the reforms in stages now. They didn't talk about stages before. And so stage 2 was the introduction of the Environmental Protection Agency and Environment Information Australia. So that passed through the House of Representatives. It's now stuck in the Senate. And I'm sure you've probably seen a bit of reporting in the last few months about there was a deal that was made with the crossbench and the minister, but Prime Minister Albanese came in and ended that deal and essentially bowed to the big mining companies and said, no, we're not going to pass this. So that was really disappointing. And the Senate is now, or Parliament is sitting in a couple of weeks' time, and that's probably is the final sitting week prior to the next election. So we are advocating for those nature positive laws to be passed with amendments, and we're having a rally next week, and I'd love you to come along for that, to show support for that. But that's sitting there. But the big chunk that's really needed is the development of the national environmental standards. And the minister has said, oh, that's stage 3, there's no timeline to that. It's kind of being kicked down the road. But in any light of that, we have been assured by the Queensland Government that the work that they're doing to develop the bioregional plans, they are using that work to inform other decisions within government. They haven't been specific, and we have slightly nudged them to ensure that they communicate that more clearly, and we're hoping that will happen soon. But so that's kind of where things are at the moment. And DECU have released the Regional Planning Initiative. So this is a bit of a policy statement that talks about how it needs to consider the cumulative impacts, which is good, and ensure that the approach they take does contribute to doing the 30 by 30, protecting 30% of the land by 2030. And you can see all of this on the on DECU's website as well. So you can see the draft standard. So a lot of work has gone into this, and there was a lot of consultation. There was these kind of lock-up consultations that happened down in Canberra that QCC attended a few times. So the work is there. It's just that kind of political will now to get it across the line. And I just wanted to play this little clip. So last year we hosted with the other state conservation councils an evening with the minister, with Minister Plibersek, and we were talking specifically about bioregional planning. One of the in the draft National Environmental Standard at the moment, it talks about conservation zones that are set up to stop a certain class of action. And our concern with that is that means that there's a conservation zone that's actually just going to stop residential development, but you might still be able to do mining or have major infrastructure there or something like that. So just the way the standard is written, it leaves the door open for things to still get part, like, for some impact still to occur in those areas, rather than early on when they were talking about bioregional planning, they said, there's kind of the go and no-go areas. And so I asked a question to her just to try and get a little bit of clarity on what is meant by classes of action. And I just want to show this to you to get a little bit of context, and see what you think. I hope this will work.
Finally, it's not one type of development, it's a type of development that's specified or another type of development that would have a similar impact on the environment. So it might be in a conservation zone that you don't want to build housing, but you wouldn't object to a transmission line over that large area or something. Like, I'm not going to kind of just make up examples as we go, but the conservation zones protect from a particular type of development that's being facilitated in the other area, or something that would have a similar impact on matters of national environmental significance.
Oh, excellent. Thank you for.
So, in relation to that, my thought is, in terms of one of these bioregional planning zones where the conservation zone is, if you're going to stop urban development or you're going to stop mining in that conservation zone, but you're still allowing broad scale clearing of threatened species habitat for pasture, then that's really not going to change anything. So that's what I was trying to kind of almost pin her on there. And she did, very much try to make it clear that actually if it's got a similar impact, so if you're bulldozing, 100 hectares, like broad scale clearing of threatened species habitat for one thing, that is equivalent to the other thing. But I think, the way it's written, there still leaves that little window. So we'll be advocating to strengthen that.
Clarify, Natalie.
How do I stop it? Okay. All right. Winding up now. Just trying to grasp, why do we really need bioregional planning? We have these ongoing competing land use pressures. And I just showed this little graphic here, obviously from inner Brisbane, where we've got two patches of habitat, but there's no corridor in between those. So within those areas, you're going to get limited genetic diversity in those species. They're not able to, go across the landscape safely. And so if we're ending up with all these little pockets, but no connection, then that's actually not a good outcome for our threatened species as well. So what bioregional planning aims to do is to ensure that, there's enough buffer zones, there's enough connectivity. When we're looking at a region from a landscape scale, what is required for those threatened species, for those ecological communities, rather than just chucking a little patch of bush here and a little patch of bush there and hoping for the best. And that's all from me. I'm now going to hand over to Bora, and thank you so much, Bora, for joining us this evening. Bora was one of the lead authors on the research that QCC commissioned from UQ. She's part of the team led by Professor James Watson. She's a PhD candidate at the Global Centre for Mineral Security and Centre for Biodiversity Conservation Science. And so most of Bora's work focuses on the impacts of mining on biodiversity, and her PhD is focusing on the impacts of renewable energy transition on biodiversity, very relevant here in Queensland, focusing on both ends of the supply chain, from the mining of commodities using the infrastructure and technologies to where infrastructure is going and how is it impacting Australia's efforts for reaching its biodiversity targets. So I'm going to hand over to Bora now. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, thank you, Natalie. So I'll go briefly through what we did for the report commissioned by QCC. I mostly worked on the methodology and the analysis, and then the team of experts worked on framing the main principles and decision rules guiding the regional planning. As Natalie mentioned, in 2022, the federal government stated that it was considering adopting a spatial based approach to regional planning under the new reformed EPBC Act. And since then, there has been multiple consultations with stakeholders where it was made clear and it is necessary for a set of foundational principles to guide the inclusion of biodiversity when consider future land use planning decisions. So our work provides a set of 8 foundational principles and 32 subsequent zoning rules, utilizing a 3-tiered zoning framework, guiding where developments are going. Red zones would be areas where developments are not allowed, and they should be strictly protected areas. Orange zones would be areas that require further assessment under the EPBC Act, and green zones would be areas where development would be allowed with no EPBC Act approval. However, there might be potential conditions for further development. And these principles were based on experience of leading conservation scientists in Queensland as well as QCC. The 8 principles, sorry, my screen. Oh, yeah, sorry. These 8 principles that we identified state that the zoning rules must be evidence-based, scientifically defensible, and very clear. The zoning rules must recognize that some areas within MNES have features that are irreplaceable and cannot be replaced with or restored within meaningful timeframes. Hence, they cannot be lost without causing irreversible damage or degradation to the MNES. A mapping of the zones should be through high-resolution data sets used to appropriately map the MNES assessed, but also recognize the some habitat features, and these areas that we called irreplaceable features cannot be mapped. The zoning rules must be robust to new scientific knowledge and to uncertainties, which means that they should be based on precautionary principles, which means that where there is serious or irreversible environmental damage, lack of scientific certainty should not be used as a reason to postpone postponing measures to prevent further environmental degradation. And they should also follow the logic of mitigation hierarchy by first avoiding the impacts, then minimizing, restoring, and finally offsetting in order to reduce the impacts of the proposed developments. And yeah, thank you. The last 2 principles state that we should use the best available scientific knowledge, but also recognize that the existing data for a lot of threatened species and communities are imperfect. And finally, if an area is identified as multiple zones, for example, both a red and orange zone, we should assign it the highest level of protection. So that would be a red zone. Can we go to, yeah, thank you. Here, I wanted to define what we mean by irreplaceability. Irreplaceability is usually defined as places or habitat features that would be very difficult to restore or recreate within meaningful time frames. And this, if these areas cannot be restored, then that would mean that it would mean that it would be hard to maintain and recover the MNES. These places or habitats or habitat features are irreplaceable if there is no clear or evidence or peer-reviewed literature that states that they can be restored or recreated. We've mentioned here some examples. For example, old-growth rainforest or tree hollows that are usually used by marsupials or bats, and mudflats we are often used by migratory bird species in Southeast Queensland. So these principles, these 8 main principles were then used to identify a set of 32 decision rules across 5 MNES or matters of national significance, which are the World Heritage Areas, National Heritage Areas, Ramsar wetlands, threatened ecological communities, and threatened species and migratory species. We identified 16 rules for red zones, 15 for orange zones, and 1 for green zones across the 5 matters of national significance. The reason why we choose the MNES is because federal regional planning approach must take into account these matters as a minimum or as a bare minimum to prevent further biodiversity loss from future developments. We use Southeast Queensland as a case study to show how these principles can be used and mapped in order to assign red zones, so highly protected areas. We did not map orange zones and green zones for this exercise, but often red zones and orange zones would overlap for a lot of species. To map the first MNES, which are World Heritage Areas, National Heritage Places, and Wetlands of International Importance, or Ramsar wetlands, we had 2 main set of decision rules. The first one, that whatever area is assigned within this within these 3 categories is said to be a red zone. And the second rule, which was not mapped due to a lack of relevant data, was that any area adjacent or nearby or connected to these areas that is needed to sustain the values of these places must be included in the red zone. But obviously that is a very hard thing to map. Then we also mapped threatened ecological communities. Only critical endangered and endangered communities are included in the MNES. There's 3 sets of decision rules to map this to map the red zones for threatened ecological communities. However, we could only map the second one, which is sites that are irreplaceable when considering the recovery of threatened ecological communities. To map this irreplaceable habitat, we used remnant vegetation, because remnant vegetation is usually areas of high ecological integrity, and therefore they are like more resilient to outside pressures and threats. And the other 2 set of decision rules were not mapped because spatial data does not exist for offsets, for examples, or areas that are near or connected to threatened ecological communities. Can we go to the next one? Yep. The next MNES is migratory species, including both birds and mammals. For this, we did not include threatened species. That was it's included further into the analysis. Here we used a data set of Australians threatened species of national environmental significance. In total, we had 20 non-threatened migratory bird species, but no mammal species. And we could only map 7 of these species based on bird species for which the experts could identify irreplaceable habitats. For some of them who had irreplaceable habitats, it could not be mapped. For example, as I mentioned before, the hollows in the trees. And the next one, please. Then we went on to map red zones for threatened species, including both mammals and bird species. Same as with migratory species, we identified a bunch of bird and mammal species that occur within Southeast Queensland, but we could only map the irreplaceable habitat features for a few of them. So in total, that was 17 threatened bird species included in the analysis and 16 mammal species. And after mapping the red zones for each of the MNES, we came up with the result that almost 40% or 39% of Southeast Queensland area was mapped as red zones. That is approximately 4,000 kilometers square of Southeast Queensland area. Most of these results was driven by the red zones required for the for protection of threatened mammal species, which made up 81% of the red zones. And if we look at the MNES individually, endangered mammals and vulnerable mammals influence most of the results by making up for 23% and 24% of Southeast Queensland area. But yeah, obviously that's the results, but there's a bit of limitations with the data sets used. Publicly available data is not to a very fine scale. There's a complexity of mapping irreplaceable habitat features or offset sites and areas that are important to be set aside for conservation of species. And also, it's hard to incorporate three-dimensional data sets that are needed for most often for bird species to protect them from developments such as wind farms or airports. But yeah, that's in a nutshell what we did. And I will go back to Natalie to.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Bora. Really appreciate going through the details of that research. And we did launch that report last year, and we gave it to both the federal environment minister and the state environment minister. And we talk quite frequently with both departments in terms of utilising that information to inform the development of the bioregional plans for Queensland. But where to from here? There are some opportunities. It's been a pretty, obviously, I think there's some people on this call who have been working in this space for a really long time and who have wanted to see reforms of the EPBC Act for a very long time. And, we almost got there, it feels, in the last year or so was the closest we'd probably ever been. And yeah, it was just really disheartening to see that things have been extended out now. So like I mentioned earlier, federal parliament is sitting on the 4th of February, and that will likely be the last time before the next federal election. And this really is the last chance to get the nature positive laws through the Senate with those amendments that are needed. Because some of the amendments that were proposed in the negotiation between the crossbench and the Environment Minister were around setting up the framework to develop the national environmental standards, which means that work can progress rather than being completely halted for stage 3. So yeah, that is happening, and that's why next week we are running that rally. So I'd love you all to come along. We'll send a link a bit later. But the work is continuing both at the state and federal level to develop those draft bioregional plans. And yeah, we are consistently advocating for those to move along quicker as well and get more transparency from the state government about how that work is coming along. And then to add into the mix, I'll hand over to Claire now, talking about the draft renewable regulatory framework. So over to you, Claire.
Yeah, thanks, Natalie. And thanks, Bora, for that explanation of the methodology and how it was applied in Southeast Queensland, which was undergoing a regional plan review last year as well. And another massive piece of policy effort is going into regulating renewables in Queensland and through the EPBC. So as well as this work on the federal level, there's also a lot of change at the moment in the state government and how it assesses renewable energy, including a draft renewable regulatory framework that is out for consultation until the 1st of February. And we are running a webinar next week on Wednesday at the same time, so 6 p.m. With the Environmental Defender's Office to explain to us how renewable energy is regulated at the moment in Queensland and what some of these proposed reforms from the new LNP government could mean for nature and the climate. So we will also send the link to that after this. And Katie's just put it in the chat, so it would be great to see some of you there next week. And now we are going to open the floor for questions. So do you want to just leave that on the slide with the rally and the action so people can think about both questions that they want to ask and also actions that they can take. So as well as the renewable regulation webinar, we also have the rally next Thursday, as Natalie mentioned, in Brisbane City. And if you are not in Brisbane, we've got a online action to email your Member of Parliament asking them to support the passage of strong nature laws for Queensland, which Katie has also just put in the chat. So please do that if you can't make it down in person on Thursday, and even if you can. So I haven't seen anyone put a question in the chat, but does anyone have a question that they want to ask? Feel free to raise your hand and we will throw to you. Well, okay, great. Luna, do you want to come off mute and ask a question?
Yeah, happy to. Thank you for this webinar. Yeah, I guess my question is, or more discussion point, like what work regional councils can do to support bioregional planning in terms of like pointing out yeah, valuable areas without like having maybe the resources to do such extensive mapping, because that might not be available to everyone. So I think, yeah, for some of the councils, that might be something to look at, like how they can still do that, or, you know, work towards that without doing a study themselves, yeah, in their area.
Thanks, Lena. Natalie, do you want to answer the question? Maybe also a bit about community consultation and ways people can be involved in bioregional
Yeah.
planning.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess there's two things. Um, Formally, the bioregional plans that are created, they will need to meet the National Environmental Standard on community consultation. And so there will be a formal consultation period that the state and federal governments need to do on each bioregional plan. So I think it's really important to, keep up to date with what's coming out of the department on that. And obviously, as QCC will be putting out information as well as soon as that stuff does go live. But my understanding is that the state will start to do a bit of regional consultation on these plans. So definitely get active in that. The other part here really is just to continue to advocate for strong new nature laws. And it's really important to kind of continually get, as much media as you can about this. If there's a patch of bushland that is being bulldozed because of whatever reason, it's just important that we have that constant drumbeat of media out there as to why we need strong new nature laws, and that, the majority of Australians do support the reforms of the EPBC Act. So I think that's kind of two of the key things that's important for regional conservation groups to do. But yeah, certainly open to anyone else's thoughts on the calls here. But yeah, I think it's important to stay engaged in that formal consultation process as well as soon as that opens up. Any other questions or thoughts?
Yeah, it's Mike Muller here, tuning in from Hanoi.
Hey,
Good,
Mike, good to
good to
see you
see a
again.
few familiar faces. Yeah, yeah. I mean, overall, I think it's a good approach. But I just wonder, how much of the red zones are already protected, as in national parks and conservation areas. So, we're really, I think, trying to protect areas at the moment that are unprotected. I think that's really the bottom line. So it'd just be interesting to see what that was. And secondly, I'm just wondering, and I guess the folk from QCC might be able to give some ideas about this, but the new or the recently elected Queensland government still seems to want to go down this track. They still sort of, are comfortable with it. They don't see it as some sort of radical greeny half-baked exercise, or because the feds are doing it, they don't want to do it.
Yeah, so I'll answer that one, Mike, and then I'll hand
Yep.
over to Bora about the specifics of those red
Yep.
zones.
Yep.
We did have a meeting with the new minister, I don't know, what is it, a month or two ago now, where we did talk about bioregional planning, and we've chatted to people in the department as well. And so far, so good. There is
Yeah.
no scale back of this body of work yet, which is good news. But obviously, yes, that is a risk. But the funding is already committed from the last two budgets, and then Chris Foley did say he would, keep the budget as is, which is good. Which they really do need that resourcing in the department to carry out the
Oh, for
work.
sure. Yeah.
So yeah, it's good news so far, but I think it's kind of a watching brief at the moment. But yeah, over to Bora about how much of those red zones already are protected, or what that kind of looks like.
Yep. Thanks.
Yeah,
Thanks, Dan.
thanks for the question. I will answer it to best of my knowledge, but then Ruben, who is also online, if he has something to add, he's more welcome to. So protected areas are not considered, are not a matter of national significance. Obviously, areas like the Gondwana rainforest, which are World Heritage sites, and the Glasshouse Mountains, which is also an area of national significance, are protected. But then, as we saw, the results were mostly driven by the range of species, of threatened species, especially mammals. I don't have a number on how much of that is protected, but I would say that it wouldn't be a large number of the red zones.
Yeah, I don't know. You've got places like North Stradbroke Island, that's protected by National Park. Just because it's not protected under federal legislation doesn't mean it's not protected, because the Queensland government, obviously, and there's all that stuff down on the border ranges. I know in the Wide Bay Burnett region now, protected areas are actually quite high. It's up, I think 15%. So 15% of our area is already protected. So that's going a good way towards the 40%. So yeah, I just wonder, because it's the areas that have no protection, that have no state legislation protection or federal protection, that are open to development for agricultural housing. That's the stuff that's really got to be tried to be protected by this sort of a setup, or this approach, which is a good one. Don't get me wrong, I think it's great, but I'd just be interested to know what extra are we going to gain? I mean, the 40% number of the Southeast Queensland planning area is a pretty good one. So, but I just think it might be something just to consider.
Yeah.
When you're looking at this.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks. Yep.
Thanks, Mike.
Yep. Thank you. Yep. That's all.
No worries. Louise has just put a question in the chat about the nature repair bill. Louise, are you able to come off mute and ask that, or do you want us to read it out?
Well, so I'm Louise Manning. I'm the president for Springfield Lakes Nature Care, but I'm also on the board of WIPSCU. And I just want to know a little bit more about, we've got the nature repair bill. So that's still being talked about, how that's all going to work and how it's going to be able to be a viable document for investors and corporations to use. So how does this bill of yours, align with that nature repair bill? And I also wanted to know is, we know a lot about offsets with developers. So they can clear land and then they'll say, oh, but we'll offset it and we'll plant X, Y, Z of trees. But we all know that planting tube stock is very different to the value of old growth trees and tree hollows. So especially for our endangered fauna and our vulnerable fauna. So how are you going to manage that in this bill? That's what I wanted to know. How are the two working together or aligning?
I will try to answer that one, but like you said, there is a lot up in the air right now. So the Nature Repair Act, which has passed, and yes, they're working out methodologies now to essentially set up this, biodiversity trading scheme, very similar to the carbon market, which has existed for a number of years already. The way that say if SEQ, as the example, in the bioregional plan for SEQ, there'll be conservation zones, and then there'll be the development zones. In those conservation zones, what I'm not clear on, and what I don't think, the policy is very clear on at the moment, is essentially what it's doing is it's front loading the offsets, or it's front loading. It's being very clear in the beginning where you can and cannot go. So the idea being that if you've got this, beautiful patch of like red zone that we see there, that is, important for MNES, that is protected, and efforts and projects go into that area to protect and restore it long term. I'm not sure of the interaction, and if anyone else is on the call and has been following this closely, please feel free to add some more context. But I'm not sure that there could be some interaction there could be a biodiversity certificate sitting on a patch of that conservation zone. But yeah, I can't tell you with any certainty, sorry. But yeah, really happy to open the floor if people know more. But yeah, a lot of it is still being developed as we speak. Like there's the Nature Repair Committee that are developing the methodologies, the framework, and what those biodiversity trading certificates and things look like.
So it's like we've got two sort of competing forces, and we've got to get something into the federal government, did you say, by February before they sit? So how do you want groups like our land care groups or societies to frame something to the federal government? How do you want us to approach that? That's probably, if there's so many unknown questions or implications, how do we frame a response to that?
Yeah, thanks, Louise. The main thing here is, or the main ask is that the federal government passes the nature positive bills with amendments. And those, so you can look on, you can see the nature positive bills on the federal government website at the moment where the legislation is listed. And so, yeah, that's the key ask. So if you're speaking to, your local federal MP, it's really important that they know that, we want to see those nature positive laws, those strong new nature positive laws passed this term of government. It is a little bit like we are semi-hopeful in some respects, but we're also pragmatic to understand that, it's likely that these bills will not pass, but that doesn't mean we don't continue to advocate and push for them. And then obviously we are coming into a federal election, so it's going to be one of the key asks really from all environment groups is that the next government does deliver on the full overhaul of the EPBC Act. So that's really important. And by having people constantly talking to the federal members about this is really important. Yeah, but the key thing is to pass the federal nature laws, the nature positive bills with amendments this term of government.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Louise and Natalie. And we've got a question from Emma. Do you want to come off mute and ask that, Emma?
Sure. You just mentioned before, Bora, about how the state of the mapping detail made it kind of hard to do the work that you were doing because it's just not there. And I know that when developers are putting in all of their applications, they have to pay people to do all these really good maps and put all the data together. So just wondering, like, if we've got these people coming to our regions trying to set up all these projects, is it an opportunity for us to say, well, hey, if you want to come to Gladstone and set up XYZ project, you need to do your mapping, and then we need you to go to this pocket of land over here, and we need you to send your mapping people there and do it as well over there. So we start to grow these maps. Is that like something that we could push for, or would it work?
I believe so, especially for things that maybe we cannot currently map, but would be good for developers to map on their interest as well, such as offsets. So I think that is a possibility.
Sorry. Hi. My name is Ruben. I participated in a little bit of this research with Bora and the rest of the team. And that sounds like an interesting idea, but I guess it's not us who would say or who could say if it can be done or not. Because so just like something that was interesting doing this piece of work is that we couldn't even get the highest level of detail for species data from the federal government because that's not publicly available. So in that respect, there's a lot of limitations in terms of what data we have and what data is available. Yes. And I just opened the maps and had a quick look on Mike's question about how much of the red zones are protected in Queensland. And it's hard to say, but just using the protected areas from KPAT, from the federal government, it doesn't look, I haven't done the overlay, just put one layer on top of the other, and there's a lot of red zones that are not actually in protected areas at the moment.
Yeah. And I also wanted to say that just because an area is protected doesn't mean there are levels of protection. And just because some area is protected doesn't mean that a development cannot go there.
Well,
there could be a protected area where there is a mine site, for example, which happens in Australia quite often.
yeah, not in national parks yet. But
no, not in strict national parks, but some protected areas still allow.
Well, going back to Ruben's comments there, I think that's a good thing. I think the more red zones that's not in a something that's already protected, like a national park or a conservation park or whatever, is a good thing. And I might add, I like the approach about, trying to map and use irreplaceability as a criteria, because I think that's something that's just not looked at present. And, tree hollows and mud flats and stuff, like that development that was going to go ahead in Redland Bay. They were talking about offsets, and then in the Gladstone Port, they talk about offsetting mud flats, and it's just ludicrous. You can't do it. So best to put it in a red zone.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ruben. And thanks, Mike. And Louise, the link that Katie put in the chat and that we will send around to the Southeast Queensland report that we have published from the UQ report has a list of the data sources that were used. And like Ruben said, we used publicly available data. So have a look at that and for the data sets that we used there. But we are coming to time on our webinar. We want to wrap up by 7 so that everyone can go and enjoy their evening. So just wanted to say thank you again for coming along tonight and for starting 2025 with a vigor to get nature positive reforms. And thanks so much to Bora and Natalie for presenting, and Ruben as well for coming along. It's been really great to work with UQ, and we hope that we can continue this partnership to get the nature positive bills passed in February, and the stage 3 reforms, including bioregional planning, underway in the next term of government. So yeah, we will send a follow-up email for everyone with all the links that we've put in the chat, and also the recording of this meeting. And thanks so everybody for jumping on, and hopefully can see a bunch of you next week at either the webinar on Wednesday night at 6 p.m. on renewables regulation, or Thursday morning in the city at 8 a.m. to show the federal government that we really want to see strong nature protection laws. So thank you so much, everybody, and we'll talk soon.
Thank you,
Claire. Thank you, Natalie.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Bora.
Ted's coming up.